This is Mr. Franklin's Math 1, Unit 2 Statistics, Lesson 2 Variability. On page 132, problem number 6, this is Part B. Problem number 6 talks about the two basketball players, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar versus Michael Jordan. We're now looking at B, which says, what summary statistics could you use to measure consistency in a player? Which player was more consistent according to each of your statistics? Well, the idea of consistency has to do with how much it changes, and you'd think that somebody who was more consistent would have less variability. So in other words, they would have lower values for either the IQR or the standard deviation. The problem, though, becomes which one to use, the IQR or the standard deviation. The first thing that I need to talk about is this number right here, the 408. That is the problem for both of these. 408 is much lower than these other numbers. I have not yet proved that it's an outlier, but for right now I'm going to work under the assumption that it is. That number 408 makes me believe that I should not use the standard deviation to compare these two players, because the standard deviation depends on the mean, which is sensitive to outliers. That means it kind of invalidates the idea of the standard deviation, which means we should look at interquartile range. But the problem says to look at both of these and try and decide which player was more consistent. Let's take a look at some of those actual numbers by looking at the CPMP tools data analysis. Here I've got the data for Kareem and for Michael Jordan. Remember, it's this 408 in Michael Jordan in the year 1986 that we're worried about. Let's look at some box plots of these two, and we should be able to see some interesting stuff here. Now, this outlier down here for Michael Jordan, and going by the 1.5 times the IQR rule, that's got to be an outlier. The IQR, of course, is the width of the box. Now, the width of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's box looks a little bit smaller than Michael Jordan's. That's the interquartile range. The player with the lower interquartile range is going to be more consistent. Looking at some actual statistics for this, for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, we can see that the quartile 3 is 2478 and quartile 1 is 2171. That means that Kareem's interquartile range is 307. As opposed to down here, Michael Jordan's interquartile range, you subtract Q3 and Q1 and you'll get an IQR of 452. Kareem, 307. Michael Jordan, 452. Kareem would be judged to be the more consistent using the IQR. Now, I said that the standard deviation is not really valid here, and let me kind of show you why. See this standard deviation number right here? The sample standard deviation for Kareem is 271. Looking down here at Michael Jordan's, his is almost 830. 829 is the sample standard deviation for Michael Jordan. That means that 2/3 of his values are within 829 points of the mean, whereas Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's 2/3 of his points scored are within 271 of the mean. That is a much, much smaller number, but it's not really valid because of that outlier. We'll deal with that outlier in the next part, in Part C, and then analyze the data again without that in Part D. But for right now, judging by the IQR, which is our best bet on this data because of that potential outlier, Kareem is definitely the more consistent player. Doesn't mean he's going to score higher on average. We figured out Michael Jordan's mean in Part A is higher, but it does mean that he's more consistent. His values cover a tighter range. And that's the end of our analysis of Part B.